My beloved family, my dearest elders, look upon me. There are truths that history seeks to silence. There are moments when the world's powerful, those who believe their script must be everyone's destiny, try to bury not just a man, but an entire movement. They come with documents sealed with the cold wax of diplomacy, and they whisper, or sometimes they shout, "Apologize, confess your guilt, bend your knee." They tell you that survival means surrender, that partnership means silence. But every now and then, thank God, a voice rises. Not a borrowed voice, not one softened by compromise, but a voice as sharp as a diamond and as raw as the earth of our ancestors. It is the sound of truth, unshaken and unafraid. This is the story of such a moment. The story of a young president, a son of the soil, who was told to apologize for speaking the truth of his people, and who chose, instead, to speak the truth of the continent. What followed was a reckoning that shook the marble halls of power, yet much of it remains untold. They don't want you to know the depth of that defiance. They don't want you to know the roar that rose from Harlem to Nairobi. Stay with me, saints. Before this service is done, you will hear what they tried so desperately to silence. This is not just history. This is prophecy being fulfilled before our very eyes. And if you are ready to stand with that truth, do more than just watch. Go on and hit that subscribe button, join this sacred circle, and share this message with every soul who knows what it means to be refused, but still rise. My brothers and sisters, to understand the fire that erupted in the United Nations, you must first understand the pressure cooker that was built around the young president. This story, beloved, did not begin in the cold corridors of New York. No, it began 2 months prior, right there on African soil, when he, this young, fiery man, took a microphone and dared to connect the suffering of his continent to the suffering that has long been televised, but ignored. He spoke, and his words were not polished for Western consumption. He said that the very same cries of the Palestinian mothers, weeping for their children, were the echoes of the cries heard in Mali, in Congo, and in Niger. He drew a line, a sharp, unyielding line, and declared, "If Africa remained silent in the face of such global injustice, then Africa was not innocent. Africa was complicit." And those words, they didn't just travel. They flew like wildfire. They landed in Paris. They singed the edges of Washington. They echoed harshly in Tel Aviv. And they certainly unsettled the high-walled marble corridors of the United Nations itself. Within 1 week, the official letter arrived. The seal of the Secretary General glared, cold and heavy. The language, they say, was diplomatic. Oh, but we know what diplomatic means, don't we? The letter said his remarks had caused tension, undermined cooperation, jeopardized relationships. Listen to me, they were not asking for clarification. They were calling him to confess. Then, the calls started. First, Paris. Polite, wrapped in that soft velvet of diplomacy that hides the iron fist. Then Washington, measured, professional, but heavy, oh so heavy, with warning. Then Tel Aviv, sharp, uncompromising. The message was perfectly consistent from every capital of the world's self-appointed jury. Soften your tone. Retract your words. Bend, son, bend before the storm. When words failed, and they did, the threats began to pour down like acid rain. Aid could be reconsidered. Sanctions, beloved, sanctions could be weighed. Partnerships, the very foundation of his nation's survival, could disappear overnight. The walls were closing in, brick by brick, economic chain by chain. And yet, the young president remained still. He was quiet, but not afraid. He was waiting. Until one night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the stillness was violently broken. His personal phone, the line known only to 5 souls, rang out in the dead of the night. On the other end, a voice introduced itself, Ambassador Richardson of the United States. Within 20 minutes, a silent black SUV, no flags, no license plates, rolled up to the presidential palace. The ambassador entered with two silent men, two shadows who never gave their names. He spread documents across the desk. Satellite images of Burkina Faso's gold mines, financial records of Chinese infrastructure deals, intelligence on Russian advisors, whispers of deals, whispers of irony, whispers of hidden partnerships. Then the ambassador spoke, calmly, professionally, but edged with steel. "We know everything," he stated, "and we are choosing for now to call it cooperation. But it could be called something else, something far less comfortable." The young president simply leaned back. He listened. He let the silence stretch out, thick and heavy with history and threat. Then he asked one question, a question as sharp as a blade forged in the flames of justice. "When your country invaded Iraq, Ambassador, did you apologize first?" The reply faltered. "When France intervened in Mali, did they seek African permission?" Silence. "When Israel bombs Palestinian schools, do they draft apology speeches?" The ambassador simply closed his briefcase. "Mr. President," he said, the steel returning to his voice, "I hope you make the smart choice." When that door closed behind them and the shadows melted back into the night, the young leader did not tremble. He did not call for comfort. He called his security chief. "How many foreign operatives are under surveillance in the capital?" 17 confirmed, came the reply. "Perhaps twice that unidentified. And our communications? All lines were tapped, but we are already feeding them false information." A slow smile, the smile of a strategist, spread across his face. "Good. Leak a story tomorrow. Tell them I am having second thoughts about the speech. Suggest I may even read their apology." It was deception, my friends, but not for survival. It was deception for strategy. While the embassies of the West began to whisper and celebrate their supposed victory, Washington murmuring that the pressure was working, the young president was preparing a message so different, so profound, that it would change everything. They thought he was bending. They thought he was breaking. They thought they had won the silence. But they did not understand one thing. The roar that was about to be unleashed in New York was first rehearsed not in the palace, but in the heart of the people. And just days later, in Revolution Square, before 50,000 citizens, he would declare his real choice. What he told them, and how that declaration set the true stage for the showdown at the United Nations, is a story they never wanted us to hear. Days later, in Revolution Square, 50,000 citizens gathered. The old women wept, the young men shouted, and the children raised their fists, though they barely understood the history they were witnessing. They knew only one thing: their pride was on the line. The leader from Ouagadougou stood before them, and he told them the truth. They thought we would apologize. They think Africa is still the continent that begs for permission to speak. He paused, letting the silence of conviction stretch across the multitude. "But I tell you this, when I stand before the United Nations, I will not bow, I will not apologize, I will not kneel." The roar that rose up shook the very foundations of the city. Beyond that square, beyond that nation, it began to stir something larger, something ancestral. A whisper that Africa would no longer ask for permission to exist. Yet, as the crowd thundered and the world watched, the greatest test was still ahead. The real battle, my family, would not be fought in Revolution Square, but in the cold, unforgiving chamber of the United Nations itself. 2 days later, the motorcade rolled into New York. But at JFK, a surprise was waiting. Not protesters, but supporters. 200 Africans from the diaspora, waving flags, holding handmade signs that declared simply, "Africa does not apologize." Some shouted his name, others, elders among them, simply wept. A young woman, perhaps a student, ran beside the car, crying out, "Make them hear us!" The leader from Ouagadougou lowered the window, looked her straight in the eyes, and nodded. In that solemn nod, a covenant was made. He would not carry only his nation. He would carry millions. He would carry the collective burden of 4 centuries of waiting. The next morning, as he prepared to step into the chamber, his foreign minister pleaded one last time, "Mr. President, we can acknowledge their concerns while keeping our dignity intact. We must consider the aid, the sanctions." The leader from Ouagadougou turned to the window, gazing not at the steel towers of Manhattan, but through them at history. "Minister, apologies create precedent. If I apologize today, truth becomes negotiable. Sovereignty becomes optional. Dignity becomes a privilege, not a right." The minister fell silent, and with that silence, the choice was sealed. What happened next would no longer be about one man or one speech. It would become a reckoning in the very heart of global power. The day arrived. New York was braced for another round of predictable speeches. But when the leader from Ouagadougou walked into the chamber, the atmosphere shifted. Delegates looked up. They expected compromise. They expected apology. They expected him to read the words they had placed in his hand. He approached the podium with no papers, no carefully polished script, just his voice, his memory, and his unshakable resolve. He adjusted the microphone once, a single, deliberate gesture, and began. "Before you ask me to apologize," he asked, the words hanging heavy and low in the air, "let me ask you, how many times have you apologized for what you have done to Africa?" Silence sprayed across the hall. Cameras zoomed in. Translators paused mid-sentence. Did Belgium ever apologize for the Congo? Did France ever apologize for Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for training militias that destabilized our region? The room grew restless. Delegates shifted, staring down at their notes, as if the paper could somehow shield them from the truth being spoken. But he pressed further. "You accuse me of inciting hatred because I spoke the truth. But when bombs fall on Gaza, you call it defense. When African children starve under your trade policies, you call it economics. When we rise, you panic." This was not the tone of a man cornered. It was the tone of a man liberated. Then, breaking all expectations, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and held it before the assembly. "I want to read you something," he said. "A message I received this morning from a 12-year-old girl in Ouagadougou." The chamber froze. Security shifted uneasily. No one had scripted this. "Mr. President," he read, his voice clear and resonant, "my teacher says you are going to America to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African." He looked up slowly, scanning the faces of the delegates. "That child," he declared, "has more dignity than this entire hall." Gasps rippled through the assembly. The French delegate, red with anger, stood and walked out. Others whispered nervously, but he continued, undeterred. "You want me to apologize? I will apologize for one thing. I apologize that it took this long for an African leader to speak, without fear in this chamber. I apologize that our children were made to believe that partnership meant subordination. I apologize that sovereignty was treated as negotiable. But I will not apologize for defending our dignity. I will not apologize for rejecting an occupation disguised as diplomacy. I will not apologize for being African and proud." By then, the silence was absolute. Not applause, not interruptions, just the overwhelming weight of truth pressing down on every corner of the chamber. 3 hours later, the ripple became an earthquake. The delegates shuffled their papers, avoiding one another's eyes. Outside the hall, journalists swarmed, but he walked past them, knowing the speech was about awakening outside it. Yet while the people roared and celebrated, storm clouds gathered quickly. Because for every action, there is a reaction, and the West was preparing its retaliation. The chamber had been stunned, but the streets were about to roar, and that roar, rising from Nairobi to Harlem, was what the West feared most. Not a speech, but a movement. My family, when the truth is spoken in one room, it rarely stays there. The echoes did not fade. They multiplied, crossing borders, crossing oceans, stirring hearts that had long grown weary of waiting for change. This was the moment the silence of 400 years began to break. The first ripple of this new tide was the emergency session called by the African Union. Ambassadors gathered in the Ethiopian mission not to talk about aid, not to discuss conditional trade, but to speak of dignity, sovereignty, and revolution. By midnight, the New York Declaration was born. It was an ironclad commitment. No African nation would again accept conditional aid or apologize for defending sovereignty. Within 48 hours, 12 presidents had signed it. This was not a favor. This was a fundamental shift. But the wave did not stop with governments. Across the continent, something unseen in decades began to stir. In Nairobi, students organized Dignity Day. In Lagos, the market women, the backbones of the economy, the silent strength of the nation, refused to sell products tied to Israeli settlements. In Accra, musicians turned the words of the Son of the Continent into song. In Cape Town, artists painted murals of African leaders in an unbroken chain. This was the soul of Africa stirring. This was the true meaning of Africa rising. The flame then leapt across the Atlantic, reaching our own shores and our sister islands. In Jamaica, a radio host broadcast the entire UN speech live on air, saying, "Finally, an African president with a spine." In Trinidad, students marched with placards reading, "No apology, no surrender." In Harlem, the very heart of the African-American experience, crowds gathered around the mural painted overnight, his silhouette against the outline of Africa, painted in blood red. No apology given. They chanted the lines from the speech as if they were scripture. The Caribbean governments were listening. Haiti's prime minister called the son of the continent directly. "You've given us permission to remember who we are." Within a week, Haiti announced its withdrawal from World Bank adjustment programs. The Dominican Republic followed, then Jamaica, then Trinidad and Tobago. The dominoes were falling. But perhaps the most powerful transformation was not in government offices nor in headlines. It was in the ordinary person. A market trader in Nigeria filmed herself refusing to sell her goods to a European buyer. "We don't beg anymore," she said. Millions watched. In Ghana, students confronted an American mining company about its profit margins. They streamed it live. In Kenya, farmers turned away European exporters, saying, "We know what our beans are worth." And then came a voice from South Africa. A girl, barely 16, stood outside a former apartheid museum, her phone camera steady. "They made my grandmother apologize for being black," she said, "but President the Son of the Continent showed us we don't have to apologize anymore." The video reached 13 million views in 2 days. The apology that was demanded had been refused. But something even greater had been given in its place: permission. Permission to stand tall, permission to say no, permission to remember that dignity was not a gift from the West, but an inheritance from their ancestors. This movement, driven by ordinary people reclaiming their economic and moral worth, exposed the historical lie. It exposed the deep generational wound. It showed us that we have spent too long negotiating our basic worth. And so I ask you, my elders, my history keepers, was this the spark of Africa's second liberation? Was this the moment when silence was finally broken and the continent began to walk in its true power? Tell me in the comments below, for history may look back and say this was the day the chains fell, not from iron, but from the spirit. What did you feel when you heard that speech? As the people roared and celebrated, the corridors of power in Washington were restless. A confidential memo circulated inside the State Department, stamped in red: African Leadership Assessment, Post Implications. It read like a confession of panic. If replicated across the continent, the Burkina Faso model will render traditional leverage ineffective within 5 years. Translation, my friends. The old tricks, aid with conditions, debt with strings, partnerships with hidden chains, were crumbling. In Brussels, the European Union debated emergency measures. Some pushed for harsher sanctions. Others warned that open hostility might only strengthen the hand of the voice from West Africa. Paris reacted with predictable fury, its media houses painting him as reckless, unfit, and dangerous. Yet, beneath the noise, one truth was undeniable. The words of a man from Ouagadougou had riddled the centuries of European certainty. They tried to create isolation. The European Union froze $27 million in development aid. The International Monetary Fund postponed a debt relief review, dangling economic pressure like a chain. But the young president had already declared, "What they call isolation, we call independence." And while Western capitals calculated, the world outside their orbit was awakening. The so-called isolation of Burkina Faso was, in truth, a connection. A deep connection. In Latin America, indigenous activists cited his speech in land rights campaigns. In Australia, Aboriginal voices echoed his refusal to apologize. Even the Pacific Islands, facing the rising waters of the climate crisis, invoked his language at international forums. "We will not apologize for defending our survival." The truth is, he had given the world's oppressed a vocabulary for their dignity. He had shown them that refusal was a political strategy. In the streets of Harlem, painted in blood red across that mural, the truth could not be ignored. No apology given. The voice from West Africa had turned their threat of isolation into a declaration of independence, not just for one nation, but for many. He had shown that the power of a collective soul can overcome the power of a collective purse. Yet the greatest shift was not in governments, nor in memos, nor in headlines. It was happening in the hearts and minds of ordinary Africans and the global diaspora who began to believe, perhaps for the first time in generations, that they could build without permission. What happened next, when this belief translated into economic and agricultural reality, was the final proof that dignity is the ultimate currency. The weeks turned into months, and what began as a single act of defiance became a movement reshaping the continent. 6 months after that UN speech, something unprecedented happened. Burkina Faso achieved complete food security, not through foreign aid, not through international loans, but through Burkinabe farmers using Burkinabe knowledge on Burkinabe land. The ancient techniques, once dismissed as primitive, proved perfectly adapted to the soil and the sky. Yields doubled, resilience returned. The nation could feed itself. Across Africa, governments began to act. 17 countries renegotiated mining contracts, demanding that the wealth beneath their soil remain in their hands. 23 established sovereign wealth funds to protect future generations. 42 signed bilateral trade agreements with one another, bypassing the middlemen of Europe and America. What had long been stalled, the African Continental Free Trade Area, suddenly accelerated, not because of boardroom deals, but because ordinary citizens demanded it. And then came the call from Addis Ababa. The African Union invited the captain to speak at its annual summit. The theme: New African Leadership for a New Century. As he prepared those remarks, he thought of the grandmother who had said she was proud for the first time. He thought of the young woman in New York who shouted beside his car. He thought of the old fighter who placed in his hand the first flag of independence. And he knew they were not asking him to speak for them anymore. They were asking him to show them how to speak for themselves. This was the moment to be unapologetically black in thought, in policy, and in spirit. The road ahead would not be easy. Sanctions would tighten. Propaganda would intensify. Foreign powers would not surrender their grip without struggle. But something irreversible had begun. A generation had seen that dignity was not a dream, but a choice. And so, the captain declared, "Do not apologize for defending your people. Do not water down your truth to make oppressors comfortable. Do not trade dignity for treaties. History remembers the bold, and history will remember this moment, not as the day Africa apologized, but as the day Africa rose." He had stood at the crossroads of history and made a choice his ancestors would recognize: dignity over comfort, truth over treaties, freedom over fear. It was no longer about one man or even one nation. It had become about a continent reclaiming its voice after 4 centuries of silence. Yet, even as the continent celebrated, the question remained: what would the world do when millions refused to kneel again? That answer was still unwritten, waiting for the faith and the courage of the next generation to deliver its final thunderous word. My dearly beloved, the journey that began with a folded piece of paper, the demands for apology, ended with a flag placed firmly in the hands of a young leader. That flag, once raised in 1960, carried the promise of freedom. And in the quiet of the presidential palace, as it lay across the young president's desk, he understood: freedom is never gifted. It is chosen again and again. The United Nations speech was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. The beginning of an Africa rising that no longer bows before the scripts of others. The beginning of a generation that refuses to apologize for existing, for resisting, for insisting on dignity. Across the continent, across the diaspora, the words are still echoing. We are not less. We are simply less represented. And now we are represented loudly, proudly, unapologetically black. This is why the world searches for updates, why every headline under Ibrahim Traore's name matters, and why every line of Burkina Faso news carries weight. This is not about one man. It is about a movement that tells the oppressed everywhere you need no permission to rise. So I leave you with this final, powerful charge. When the next demand for apology comes, when the next script of surrender is placed before us, remember that dignity is always an option. We do not measure power in dollars. We measure it in the pride of our people, in the courage of our children, in the legacy of our ancestors. We measure it in the spirit of Africa rising. And now I turn to you. Will history say that you watched this moment and stayed silent? Or will history say that you stood with those who chose themselves over submission? If you believe dignity is non-negotiable, if you believe Africa has nothing to apologize for, if you believe we must be unapologetically black in our global dealings, then subscribe, hit that bell notification, share this message widely, and let your voice join the chorus. Because the next time they try to silence one of us, they must hear millions behind him. No apology, no surrender, only Africa rising. Amen.